From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Librarian of Congress, Dr. James H. Billington.
Thank you very much. We are honored this evening on the occasion of the first presentation of the Kluge Prize for Lifetime Achievement in the Human Sciences to have a number of distinguished guests. I'd like to first of all recognize and thank Her Royal Highness Victoria, the Crown Princess of Sweden, who's with us for this occasion, Ambassador Jan Eliasson, Mrs. Kirsten Eliasson of Sweden. They represent the country in which the Nobel Awards are being conferred in this very season, and their guidance and help has been instrumental in perfecting, we hope, this procedures for this prize. I'd also like to mention and thank Mr. Boguslav Rymik, the Chargé d'Affaires of the Polish Embassy, for being with us tonight. And I would also pay special thanks and our gratitude to John Kluge, who is the benefactor not only of this, but of a wide variety of fellowships to bring scholarship into this city, who is, with his characteristic modesty, asked not to be specially recognized, but his name has to be mentioned. And I want to pay special thanks this evening to the Congress of the United States. We are the Library of Congress, founded at the very time the Congress decided to relocate in the new Capitol here in Washington. We have with us tonight a variety of congressmen who are either coming or about to come. Senators Ted Stevens, Christopher Dodd, Representatives Vern Ehlers, Rush Holt, Jack Kingston, Dale Kildee, John Larson, Jim Leach, John Mica, Jim Moran, David Price, Ralph Regula, Rodney Frelinghuysen, and Edmund Markey. The Congress has created and faithfully nurtured within its own branch this enormous knowledge and information asset for the intelligent governance of the United States. And it has chosen in its wisdom to allow free public access to our ever-growing body, of an ever-growing body of knowledge to a ever-growing audience here and virtually through the internet, to keep democracy dynamic. And especially thank the Joint Committee on the Library, which is the oldest joint committee of the Congress, which is led by its chairman, Senator Ted Stevens, the President pro tem of the Senate of the United States, and a distinguished senator from Alaska, and his vice chairman, Representative Vern Ehlers of Michigan. This committee has been of great importance historically to the library, and it's an honor to have members of the committee with us tonight, also from our appropriations committees that make it possible for this institution to function. And it is my great pleasure and distinct honor now to introduce to you one of the really truly great supporters of this institution in its long 203-year history, the distinguished chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, the chairman of the Joint Committee on the Library, a great friend of learning, and the President pro tem of the Senate of the United States, the Honorable Senator Ted Stevens of Alaska.
Good evening, friends of the Library of Congress. I'm very pleased to be here tonight on behalf of the United States Congress for the awarding of the first John W. Kluge Prize for lifetime achievement in the humanities and social sciences. And of course, I've already given my congratulations to Professor Kolakowski for his high honor. As chairman of the Congress's Joint Committee on the Library, it was my privilege to participate in the Capitol ceremony when John Kluge presented the Library of Congress an endowment of $60 million to establish the Kluge Center. This award is the capstone of the Kluge Center's mission to bring the world's leading thinkers to our Library of Congress, to use its rich resources to stimulate scholarship and interaction with policymakers in Washington, thus bridging the scholarly and policymaking worlds. I join all of you once more in thanking our great friend John Kluge for his generous philanthropy to this library. Our Librarian of Congress, Jim Billington, also deserves our eternal gratitude for his visionary leadership of this great institution. It's nice to be with you.
Thank you very much, Senator Stevens. We meet tonight in an institution that arose from the personal library of a great humanist, Thomas Jefferson, in a building that's named for him and has been gloriously restored by the Congress of the United States, which created this institution in the first place. And we are celebrating in this ceremony the highest form of Jefferson's pursuit of happiness, the pursuit of truth. This is the essence of what happens in big ways and small in any library. The pursuit of truth, after all, helps keep us from the pursuit of each other. This pursuit has been the life's work of the first scholar to be awarded this unique international prize in the study of humanity. And you know, it's rather appropriate in a way that it should be someone from Poland, since people like Pilsudski and Kosciuszko were part of the founding fathers, fought in our War of Independence, and helped bring this country into being in the first place. Kluge Prize is designed with a high level of scholarly accomplishment and with the high level of compensation, I might add, of the Nobel Awards, and it fills in a gap between the natural sciences that are so well honored on the one hand in the Nobel Prizes and peace and literature, which are recognized in the others. It is for this lifetime of achievement in the scholarship of the human condition that this award is being made, and it's appropriate, I think, to make it in America's capital, since so much scholarly work in these fields has been done in this country. First and foremost, the criterion we established was achievement of high distinction in a chosen academic field as attested to by one's peers. Additional considerations were whether or not his or her scholarly work has also in other disciplines in a significant way, and in some sense, the broader public of the humanity, which is the subject of this. By all three of these criteria, Kolakowski emerges as a giant of the second half of the 20th century. In a wide variety of languages and formats, he has focused his life on asking big questions. He is a gifted and accessible philosopher, a theoretian of European culture, a historian of religion, and an essayist of enormous sweep, all filled with the gentle irony and humor that great humanists often are able to display. And last but by no means least, he was a major contributor to and an intellectual inspiration for the Solidarity movement in Poland, which played such a decisive role in the peaceful, nonviolent, and deeply democratic emergence of Eastern Central Europe from the totalitarian system that had been imposed on it and was long thought by many to be a permanent system of rule. The modern world has given birth to something we call an intelligentsia, people of learning whose lives are somehow set apart from the ordinary and are centered on cultivating ideas for higher moral purposes. The word intelligentsia arouses some suspicion in the English-speaking world because it suggests people cut off from everyday life, likely to promote utopian ideas that could have disastrous practical consequences. But the word intelligentsia was in fact invented by Poles in the early 19th century after they had lost their freedom. And the better anti-utopian version of an intelligentsia played a decisive role in helping bring freedom back to Poland in the late 20th century. Arnold Toynbee and his mighty 12-volume study of history suggested that large-scale systems of government continue to prevail until they meet challenges to which they cannot, by their very nature, find an adequate response. The Solidarity movement in Poland was that type of challenge. It was a mass-based, religiously grounded, bottom-up, nonviolent challenge to a top-down, anti-democratic elite with an atheist ideology and an authority based on fear. It had no way of adequately meeting the challenge posed. The word intelligentsia, in its original Polish usage, was simply taken from the Latin word for intelligence. And Leszek Kolakowski embodies that quality, and he spoke more clearly and more influentially to the intelligence of the rising, better educated generation in Poland than any other single figure. He was the voice of hope that helped free people from the paralysis of fear. The chain of events that brought down the communist system in Eastern Europe began in Poland with a movement inspired both by religious faith, of which Kolakowski has made studies as deep as any European scholar of his time, and also by straightforward, human, enlightened intelligence applied to inhuman social realities, which Kolakowski performed with elegance and significance. In the words of one of the great leaders of Solidarity, Bronisław Geremek, who later became foreign minister of Poland, and I'm quoting this, which is, I think, the right introduction. We have, incidentally, a formal citation, which I'm not going to read, but I think these words speak eloquently. He said, Leszek Kolakowski's work had an influence on the course of events that is difficult to overestimate. His work achieved that fulfillment which is the eternal dream of philosophers and the ambition of intellectuals, to influence the fate of the world and further people's aspirations of freedom. It accompanied resistance to repression and dictatorship in Eastern and Central Europe at every stage. This skeptical student of enlightenment, this scholar of the highest intellectual rigor, this opponent of all illusions, played that most romantic and Promethean of roles. He was the awakener of human hopes. Kolakowski was asked in an interview recently what of his many achievements he was most proud of. And he said with his characteristic modesty, simplicity of great philosophers, I'm not proud. If there is any doubt that the study of humanity can help do great things for humanity without violence and without from one passing dogmatism to another, he stands before us tonight. The man who is not proud, but of whom we at the Library of Congress, and I think all of us here, are very proud and grateful, have every reason to be, since we are hailing him as the first recipient of this prize in the human sciences for a lifetime of rare achievement. We are going to bring out in just a moment. We will present him with the medal, and then we will be seated, and we will have the world's premiere of a special salute written for him by one of the current senior scholars at the Kluge Center, the holder of the Papa Marku in education at the library. Miss Libby Larson, a great composer from Minnesota, and this will be the first time anyone in the world will have heard this fanfare that she has written especially for this occasion and for this man, and it's my pleasure to bring him out now and to present him with the first John W. Kluge Prize for Lifetime Achievement in the Human Sciences. Ladies and gentlemen, Leszek Kolakowski.
What?
We sit, you listen to the fanfare first before you speak.
Oh, I see.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Library of Congress is pleased to present the world premiere performance of Fanfare for Humanity, an original composition by Libby Larson, commissioned for the Kluge Prize. Dr. Larson is the current occupant of the Hristos Papamarkou Chair in Education at the John W. Kluge Center. Please welcome Dr. Libby Larson. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Leszek Kolakowski.
Mr. Director of the Library of Congress, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I couldn't have heard properly everything what James Billington said because I was put in a dark cellar. But I presume that what he said was friendly to me. Now, it's really extremely difficult to express the gratitude for this extraordinary distinction properly. I'm not even sure to whom, except of course for a few people, should I express this gratitude, because, well, to the James Billington in the first place, of course, he was the main architect of this, to Mr. Kluge, who was who established the whole thing. And then Mr. Professor Gifford, who had a lot of work, if I understand, in preparing the whole thing. But apart from that, there were, as far as I was told, there were many people who were active in the process of selecting this, of reviewing and selecting. So I don't know their names, or hardly any. So I have to thank them collectively only. Thank you very, very much. I repeat what I already had the opportunity to say today. I learned about the Kluge Award a few months ago when I got a letter asking me to nominate a candidate for the award, which I did. And unfortunately, I didn't succeed. This person did not get the award. All right, so then, however, I knew nothing about the Kluge Center I learned about it only quite recently, and I found it astonishing and really a marvelous, a great idea, which will be, I hope, an extremely helpful instrument to deal both with a cooperation of scholars from various countries, various parts of the world, and, which is new, cooperation and exchange of thought between scholars and politicians, something that's extremely needed and useful. I hope it will work. I think we should all thank James Billington for this great idea, and I thank him especially. Well, then I have to thank many people, including, of course, my two girls, my wife Tamara and my daughter Agnieszka, who are always extremely helpful in whatever I'm doing. It's not that they are uncritical, no. Very often they criticize what I'm doing, criticize my texts, and more often than not, they are right in their criticism. So I thank both them both. Now I would like to say a few words. It won't be long, I promise. And something which has a title. What the past is for. What the past is for. So I start with a few words about the future and the so-called futurology. According to my definition, futurology is an extremely serious science whose subject not only is non-existent, but necessarily non-existent. That is to say, the future does not exist and never will, which is a common sense remark. But we have a science about this non-existent subject. Perhaps we would not find this worrying if we did not immediately bring to our attention an analogous but much more terrifying insight, namely that the past doesn't exist either. From the time of St. Augustine and his classic reflections on the subject, the mystery of time has absorbed and tormented nearly all major philosophers, up to Bergson, Husserl, and Sartre. The past, by definition, is an ocean of events that once happened, and those events are either retained in our memory or so that they exist only as part of our psychological reality, or they are reconstructed by us on the basis of our present experience. And it is only this present experience, our present reconstruction of the past, that is real, not the past as such. In other words, the entire realm of the past exists only, it seems, as a portion of our, or more strictly, of my own consciousness. The past in itself is nothing. This argument can strike us as a kind of sophistry or a bizarre philosophical exercise. But it's not so. It's not sophistry. It is serious. However, we can also look at the question from another angle. Everything we see or touch is obviously a product of events that had happened once, perhaps 10 seconds ago, perhaps 10 million years ago. Is it not therefore proper and reasonable to say that whoever we see or touch is the past? In metaphysical terms, the past is perhaps nothing, but in terms of our direct experience, the past is everything. Our entire knowledge of the so-called external world is nothing but a continuous, uninterrupted stream of acts whereby what was the past becomes present. Yes, we may say that far from being nothing, the past is everything. And the enigma of time is not just something philosophers have constructed to amuse themselves with when they try to unravel its mysteries. No, the mystery is accessible to everyone. Although, of course, not everyone likes to spend time in thinking about time. It is only philosophers who try to express this everyday experience. So now the digression. Philosophy is not there to be liked. It's not likable. I remember a colleague of mine, a professor of philosophy, telling me about his 6-year-old son who was the first time in the school. And the teacher asked all the children to say their names and then to ask what their fathers were doing. And the boy refused to say anything. And the teacher was angry. And later at home, he explained, but I couldn't tell them that my daddy is a philosopher because all the children would laugh at me. And indeed, they would have laughed at him. But if the boy had said that his father was, say, a circus clown, they would have laughed as well. Even though it is a nice, respectable job to be a circus clown. Moreover, they would have laughed if the boy had said that his daddy was a garbage collector. Even though the profession of garbage collector is not only respectable, but is one of the most important in today's world. Without garbage collectors, we would not survive for long. And so, in matters of philosophy, let us not rely on the opinions of those kids. One might add that the profession of a philosopher has a significant affinity with the two professions I've just mentioned, that of a circus clown and that of a garbage collector. But this was a digression. Let's go back to the problem of the past. So, our direct experience may be plausibly interpreted as a form of contact with the past. But we can also speak of knowledge of the past in a more specific sense, namely our knowledge of human history. And we may ask what this kind of knowledge of the past is for. In the tradition of the Enlightenment, we sometimes find a kind of scorn or disrespect for historical knowledge, either because history, more often than not, is an infinite display of human stupidity and cruelty, or because nothing profitable can be learned from what mankind was up to earlier, or else because history is not a science. It is indeed arguable that we cannot use historical knowledge to help in our present work. So it's not a technical help we can expect from it. It may be true that whatever people know about, say, military exploits of Alexander the Great or Hannibal would not be of much use in improving the skills of today's generals, and that knowledge, say, of the political intrigues at the French royal court in the 17th century would not be of much help to contemporary politicians. However, the limited technical support to be gained from an acquaintance with the historical events is not a good reason for concluding that, therefore, historical knowledge is irrelevant to our life. We are, of course, the cultural, though not necessarily physical, heirs of Alexander the Great, Hannibal, and French monarchs. Not to say that their life, their deeds or misdeeds, it's not the reason that they do not matter to our life. To say so would be almost as silly as saying that it would not matter to me if I were suddenly to erase from my memory my own past personal life, just because, obviously, I live in the present, not in the past. The history of past generations is our history, and we need to know it in order to be aware of our identity, in the same sense in which my own memory builds my personal identity, makes me a human subject. So we learn history in order to know who we are. From the assumption that history is not a science, but rather an art, it does not follow, of course, that it is not interesting or unworthy of being cultivated. Obviously not so. But it is a trivial point. But saying that history is not a science may suggest that unlike the natural sciences, it simply does not try to establish general laws, but is concerned only with particular events, unique and unrepeatable. This question has been discussed since the 19th century. It resulted in the well-known distinction made by Rickert between nomothetic and ideographic disciplines, between disciplines in which laws are discovered and disciplines which are just concerned with the narration of singular occurrences. In fact, yes, there is no such thing as the laws of history in the sense of true and justifiable statements that would tell us in what certain well-defined conditions some certain well-defined phenomena necessarily, invariably occur. The belief in laws of history was a Hegelian or Marxian delusion. Human history is a collection of unpredictable accidents, and each of us can easily cite any number of instances where an event that was clearly decisive in shaping the history of mankind for subsequent decades or centuries could have gone in different way than it did. There was nothing necessary in its happening or in its result. The phrase, the loss of history, has also been used to describe tendencies or trends that are bound to prevail in the near future. This use was particularly frequent in Marxist doctrine, and its ideological meaning was that future events could be foreseen on the allegedly scientific basis. Alas, all the predictions made by Marx or later by later Marxists, all of them were demonstrably false. Social development went in an entirely different direction. The middle classes, instead of gradually shrinking and disappearing, as the Marxist prophecy would have it, grew and grew. The market, far from being an obstacle to technological progress, as Marxists claim, proved to be its more powerful stimulus. The relative and absolute pauperization of the working class failed to occur. The falling rate of profit, which was supposed to be the cause of the collapse of capitalism, proved a vain hope. The proletarian revolution, it is revolution resulting from the conflict between industrial workers and capitalism, this revolution never happened. The Russian Revolution was in a way an example of it. What perhaps came the closest to such a revolution, at least conceptually, that was perhaps the workers' movement in Poland in the early 80s. And this movement was directed against a socialist state and carried under the sign of cross with the blessing Pope. So much for scientific predictions. One may say that in general, futurology, so-called, is not a healthy state, and this for a number of reasons. But there is another important way in which the nihilistic approach to history is expressed today. This is the post-Nietzschean phase, also known as postmodernism. And it says, there are no facts, only interpretations. This is, in one sense, it is trivially true, and in another sense, it is absurd and dangerous. It is trivially true that any description of a fact, even the simplest, involves the entire history of human culture. When I say, for instance, this morning, on the October 29th, 2003, I ate yogurt for breakfast, my words encompass the entire history of the European calendar with all its arbitrariness. They encompass the concept of breakfast and the concept of yogurt, which are all human inventions. The language I use is a product of human history, and in this sense, whenever we use it, we interpret the world. For the world never shows itself to us, so to say, directly, so to say, stripped and naked in its purity. We always perceive it mediated by our culture, our history, our language. But this saying that there are no facts, only interpretations, has another and dangerous meaning. Since historical knowledge is supposed to consist in the description of facts, of things that really happened, the idea that there are no facts in the normal sense this idea implies that interpretations do not depend on facts, but the other way around. The facts are produced by interpretations. Let us suppose that I stole a bottle of wine from a shop. The saying, Mr. K stole a bottle of wine, would be an interpretation which generates the fact. The fact in itself does not exist. Consequently, phrases like Mr. K is guilty of stealing a bottle of wine or Mr. K should be punished for his crime have no meaning in relation to a fact. They are just part of the interpretation. In other words, the concept of moral judgment and therefore also the concept of good and evil are empty. They do not refer to an empirical reality, but only to our way of judging reality, judging according to an a priori conceptual framework. The doctrine that there are no facts, only interpretations, in fact abolishes the idea of human responsibility and moral judgments. Moreover, in effect, it considers any myth, any legend or fable just as valid in terms of knowledge as any fact that we have verified as being verified as such according to the standards of historical inquiry. In epistemological terms, any mythical theory is just as good as any historically established fact. The story of Hercules fighting against the Hydra is not worse, no less true in historical terms than the history of Napoleon being defeated at Waterloo. There are no valid rules for establishing truth. Consequently, there is no such thing as truth. And there is no need to elaborate on the disastrous cultural effect of such a theory. Now, the upshot of my remarks is, in fact, banal. Also, the legacy of myth is certainly an important and fertile source in human culture. We must defend and support simply traditional research methods elaborated over centuries, and establish the factual course of history and separate it from fantasies, however nourishing those fantasies might be. The doctrine that there are no facts, only interpretations, should be rejected as obscurantist. And we must preserve our traditional belief that the history of mankind, the history of things that really happened, woven of innumerable unique accidents, is the history of each of us, human subjects, whereas the belief in historical laws is a figment of imagination. Historical knowledge, obviously, is crucial to each of us, to school children and students, to young and old. We must absorb history as our own, with all its horrors and monstrosities, as well as its beauty and splendor, its cruelties and persecutions, as well as all the magnificent works of human mind and hand. We must do this if we are to know the proper place in our universe, to know who we are and how we should act. One might ask, what's the point of repeating such banalities? The answer is simply that it is important to keep on repeating them again and again. because these are banalities we often find it convenient to forget. And if we forget them, and if they fall into oblivion, we'll be condemning our culture, and that's to say ourselves, to ultimate and irrevocable ruin. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much for your patience.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.